Hello, New York Giants fans. Ed Valentine and Emily Iannaconi here on Big Blue View as we discuss another New York Giants debacle. Sunday's 34-10 loss to the Philadelphia Eagles. This is sort of becoming our Monday morning therapy session.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully you guys find it therapeutic. I know that Emily and I do. So good morning, Em. How are you?
I am doing okay, Ed. How are you?
I am just fine. I always promise myself that I will stay out of the comments at Big Blue View that I
Mm.
but I always find myself in there at least trying to see what folks are saying, and and I always realize every time I go in there it's like, why? Why am I here? Why do I want to read this stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sorry, there is nothing you can say, there's nothing you can write, there is no analysis you can give or opinion you can give at this point that just isn't going to anger somebody at this point when the Giants are 4-11.
No, and you almost can't blame people a little bit too. It's frustrating. I mean, this has reached historically bad lows, and the second half yesterday was just a wash. I was almost frustrated that I couldn't put on the Patriots game or the Bengals game or any of the other good games that were happening. But I had to keep
I
watching, and it
I will
wasn't
admit,
worth
I
it.
will admit, I will admit to flipping channels during the
Hmm.
commercials to find something that
Definitely.
that that looked like good, relevant football. Is it
Oh,
is it
definitely.
is it that much to ask to just be relevant, even if you don't
Right.
make it? Just be relevant.
Right. I
It,
I I think I put on Red Zone when Joe Burrow threw another insane pass to Jamar Chase, and I was like, look at this. Like, look at the excitement on the fans'
yeah,
faces in Cincinnati.
I mean that's what kills me is
Hmm.
it's been it's been 5 years now since the Giants have even been relevant, since they've played
Right.
a football game of any real importance. I mean, forget last year when they were 6-10 and they could have, backed into the playoffs in some sort of ridiculous fashion and been the first
Right.
6-win team to ever make the playoffs, because that's just ridiculous, and that's
Nothing to hang your hat on.
nothing to be proud of. But it's like,
Yeah.
when is the last time the New York Giants played a football game in which they were relevant? I think
Right.
it's when I think it was boat trip week.
Boat trip week.
Yes, boat trip week.
The infamous week that
Yeah.
truly isn't there are stats about that, what our record has been like since that boat trip, right?
Yeah, but I I don't even think I want to look it up, Em,
No,
right
I
now.
don't
It's
know them off the top of my head, and I might
No,
keep
I
it
don't
that
know them
way.
off the top of my head, but it's bad.
Yeah,
It's
it's
bad.
bad.
It's 5 straight double-digit loss seasons, and I realized this morning that if they lose out, if they lose 2 more games, this is the second 13 loss season in franchise history.
Wow.
And the last one got Ben McAdoo and Jerry Reese fired before the season ended.
Before it even ended. And
Yep.
that's crazy too, because it is a longer season, obviously, this year, but
It's
that could
just
happen
one
next
game, but
week.
yeah. Well, I mean,
It's just one game, and that could happen next week, which is still the same amount of games.
it
So,
would be 4-12 if they lose next week. So you'd have to lose both games to
right,
get to 13. But still,
right.
it's it's just
Wow.
it's hard to fathom how this franchise fell so far. I mean, teams, even bad teams, accidentally have, mediocre to good seasons once in a while. Even during the
Mhm,
wilderness years, when the Giant from
mhm.
64 to 80, I looked it up the other day, and I think even during that 17-year stretch, I think the Giants had 5 years of 500 or better football, during
Wow.
which they probably would have made a wild card berth, once or twice
Right.
if that had existed at that time.
Right.
But
Right.
it's
That's
just
true.
so, as bad as those years were, this is a shorter stretch, but it's hard to fathom being this bad for this long.
Right, right. It's different because it's not as long amount of time, but it's a shorter period, but the quality is perhaps worse in that
Mm-hmm.
shorter period. So it's kind of like a pick your poison situation. Would you rather be somewhat mediocre for longer or just really bad for hopefully shorter? That's the only thing, is that right now we don't even know how long this is going to last and when we're going to start to see the light again.
Yeah, before we even get to finding the light at the end of the tunnel, let's spend a couple of minutes talking about yesterday.
Hmm.
And I do have to say, credit to Jake Fromm for standing up in front of the media last night and basically and taking ownership of how bad it was and how bad he was,
Hmm.
and not ducking it in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I felt terrible. This is a young kid who was so excited to get his first NFL start, his first opportunity,
Yeah.
had his family at the game, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And he basically came out of the game and said, "I embarrassed my family."
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
No, I know.
which he kind of did, but but the Giants, they didn't help him. I mean, I
No.
I I felt bad. I mean, between Fromm and Mike Glennon, we've said it over and over, but I don't even know who the quarterback for the Giants is going to be next year. Joe Judge says it's going to be Daniel Jones if Judge is back. I mean, it might be Russell Wilson. It might be Jimmy Garoppolo. Who knows?
Mhm.
But whoever it is, you've got to actually invest something in finding a real NFL backup quarterback.
Mhm. Mhm. I think the past, you know, 3, 4, 5 games have really proven that for the Giants and just how invaluable that is and how important it is to have someone who can step up when players are down because I mean, it seemed obvious that Mike Glennon couldn't start yesterday's game. And then you saw Jake Fromm's performance through 3 quarters. He was eventually taken out of the game. And it just became, again, a kind of another pick your poison situation. Who do you want to go with? And I don't necessarily think that's Fromm's fault. This is still very new to him. He's still learning an entire playbook. He's a young kid. And I agree. I think after the game,
Mm-hmm.
he was like, I embarrassed this organization. He's been a part of this organization for mere weeks. Give him
Yeah.
credit for saying that. Like,
I
I
mean,
completely agree with you. I think he did have poise at the podium and things like that, which is worth knowing and worth noting. But I mean, if you have no one to turn to in that moment, you're on someone who's a third stringer, and then you're going back to the second stringer, and neither of which are performing well at all. I mean, we weren't even competitive. The entire offense played poorly, of course,
mm-hmm.
but it starts with the quarterback, as always. I know Judge was asked about that after the game too, how much that impacts the overall play. And the end of the day, if you don't have someone who can just try to lead an offense, then you're not really putting your best foot forward from the get-go.
No, you could see from the opening drive that the Giants really had no faith that they could run a competent offense, and it's not necessarily fair to sit here and say Jake Fromm is a terrible quarterback. He was put in a
Mm-mm.
bad situation where he's been with a team for less than a month against
Mhm.
a good defense, with a broken offense around him. And I didn't want to believe that it could get worse than watching, Mike Glennon play quarterback for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But it got worse.
Yeah.
And the thing that killed me last night, the Eagles in the first half, the Eagles were there to be taken.
Yes.
The
Yes.
Eagles, I wrote that, Philadelphia is a very hostile place.
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and and yet the Eagles, from fumbling the opening kickoff to fumbling a ball on their first series, neither of which the Giants could recover, to a half a dozen penalties, to a brutal dropped interception and a bunch of other dropped passes. They tried really, really hard to give
Mhm.
the Giants a chance yesterday,
Right.
and the Giants couldn't do anything about it.
No, no. From the very beginning, it looked like we're going to force some early turnovers from opening kickoff, from first special teams play of the game. It felt like we could have come away with a turnover, and that was a common theme. I mean, not so much in the second half. The second half isn't really worth even addressing very much, but you're 100% right. There were so many easy mistakes that we just didn't take advantage of, and we had lots of strong field position, even without capitalizing on potential turnovers. We continue to have strong field position throughout the first half, especially the first quarter. And again, I mean, everyone knows the final score. We ultimately came away with a field goal in the first half. We didn't take advantage of any opportunity. I know that's something Judge said again after the game, and that was something we didn't show up at all for.
No, and like you said, the second half was just not worth even talking about. Although the only thing in the second half that I even remotely want to mention is the fact that maybe it's just me, but I took the the touchdown pass to Lane Johnson, to the offensive
Mhm.
tackle, when the score was already 20-3 and the game was already over. I don't know. I took that as a slap in the face to the Giants. I took that as kind of rubbing their face in the dirt or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that bothered me. I know they're having fun and they want to get their offensive lineman a touchdown and all that.
Yeah.
But for me, that was kind of rubbing the Giants' faces in it a little bit.
Yeah, and and then he ran into the stands and he jumped up and he is all excited. I mean, he's played for 9 seasons. He never has a touchdown. I understand that it's exciting and they're having fun, and I understand all of that. But at the end of the day, this is an 8-7 Eagles team. They didn't clinch a playoff berth yesterday. They kept their hopes alive. I understand that that's worth being excited about, but I agree that, while it's worth celebrating, it was a little over the top considering the circumstances. If they punched their ticket to the playoffs yesterday, I guess sure, do whatever you want. That's very impressive with the first year head coach, and they kind of came out of nowhere with a second half push. But I kind of agree. It just wasn't necessary at all.
No, I didn't think so. But if you use the word necessary, what is necessary for the New York Giants is somehow, some way figuring out how to get this franchise pointed in the right direction. And I don't know, did you get a chance to read any of the explosive reporting last week about the internal workings of the Giants organization? Did you happen to see any of that?
Yes, I saw some of that. Yes.
And you
Explosive.
read that, you read that. Well, I always take some of that and with a grain of salt,
Hmm.
because anyone who has lost a job, asked about the organization and the people who fired him, is going to have some bitterness, especially if you've been there for a long period of time.
Hmm.
And yet, so the truth has to be somewhere in the middle. There has to be some dysfunction. There has to be some, obviously questionable work by Dave Gettleman. There has to
Hmm.
be probably more involvement, use the word interference if you want, from the Mara family than maybe I was aware of previously, in terms of decisions and day-to-day personnel, and I just don't know. I don't know how you fix it at this point. I don't know if I'd even want to be the new GM at this point.
I know they're definitely not painting a strong picture. I think that the things that the Giants have built themselves on as an organization for many years are getting lost and have gotten lost over the course of the past 5 seasons, that it's getting harder and harder to see what, the Giants as an organization and the Mara family really just kind of hung their hats on day in and day out, no matter what. And I think we're just losing sight of that. I think the fact that yesterday the Giants, they've started 3 quarterbacks in the season for the first time since 1992. I mean, I know this happens to teams. I know this isn't necessarily abnormal in the NFL. I think they're the 7th team this season for it to happen to, but I think because it's happening to the Giants this season, it's kind of just an on-field sort of symbol of just like the greater dysfunction as a whole, that the Giants have just never been this way. There's always been certain things that you could count on them for: stability at quarterback, playing hard-nosed defense, and there's just certain things that you could just rely on them to be. And we've lost sight of that now. We don't even know who our quarterback is. I mean, that's tough for any organization, but for an organization that's known Eli Manning for so long and just had the reliability of players, we're just so far removed from that at that point that it's hard to remember what it looked like anymore.
And we're at that point where John Mara apparently came out. Well, he didn't necessarily come out, but there was a report which you would have to think was probably leaked from somewhere within the Giants hierarchy, that the plan as of now is to keep Joe Judge, keep Daniel Jones, and probably, hire a new GM. And I talked to Dan Hatman, who's director of the Scouting Academy, about this last week. And he said, if you're going to hire a GM and give him all of those constraints and give him the current front office and the current, involvement of ownership and the way that things are done, how do you expect a new GM to change anything?
Mm-hmm.
If you're basically going to tell him that you get the GM job, but
you can't change anything.
But you can't change anything because these are the people that are in our front office because they're family, and these are and this is the quarterback because I like him, and this is the head coach
because I want to be right about him.
Because I hired him and I want to be right.
Mm-hmm.
Now go make it work.
Right.
How does that work?
No, absolutely. No one can, even the best possible GM candidate cannot make that work.
And, something that I didn't realize that Ty Dunn's reporting last week in the Go Long series of articles that he wrote about the Giants, part of his reporting, was talking about the front office and the scouting staff. And it made me go back and look not only at who is in the scouting department, who's in the front office, but what their qualifications are and how they got there. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize until I really looked closely at it just how many Mara family members and or family friends are in the front office, and how many of those scouts and personnel people never played football. Oh. Not that you can't learn the game and learn to study it and learn, mm-hmm. What makes a good player and what doesn't. But there's something about having the connections and having that knowledge of what it feels like to make those plays and not make those plays, and having been inside the game, that I have to think helps. And mm-hmm. and I just didn't, I really didn't realize until I went and looked hard at it, just how much of that there is in the front office. And I shake my head because I don't care how good the GM is and how qualified he is.
Right.
I don't know how you make it work under those circumstances. I just don't.
No. I mean, there's a complete lack of urgency if you know someone or you know someone who knows someone, and that's the reason you have a role. I mean, at the NFL level, there should always be a sense of urgency, because if you don't perform well, you could not be there tomorrow. I mean, so many people could take that job, and so many people want these jobs. There's only 32 of them. They're obviously very, very rare. And so if you take away that sense of urgency as an employer, as someone making high level decisions, you have a sense of security that is almost a little dangerous at the NFL level, at any elite level. If it doesn't even, I mean, take that away, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even need to be at the NFL level. Anyone who just feels a little too secure is not necessarily going to go out of their way to, find new solutions or make new things work or get new perspectives or even admit that they're wrong. That needs to be the first thing that happens. Is people need to step up and say, I made a mistake and I did this wrong. And this is how I think we can fix it. People who really care about the organization are going to want fresh perspective and are going to want change. But of course, that comes with its own instability as well. And so I think that's very interesting. We know the Giants have always been a family organization, and that's part of what makes them great. But sometimes people's strengths are also their weaknesses, and it seems like it might be a blind spot for them.
And we talked about Kevin Abrams last week, about the possibility that the Giants would just promote Kevin Abrams from assistant GM to GM. And I think we have to talk about it a little bit more. I mean, I do understand the theory of, well, he's got 2 years working with Joe Judge, and we're leaning into Joe, we're keeping Joe, so let's give him a GM that he's already got a relationship with. And yet it doesn't fix any of the things that we're already talking about here. And it also it doesn't necessarily turn Joe into what Bill O'Brien was in Houston, where they made a mediocre to bad head coach, also the general manager, but it does turn him into sort of the de facto general manager. It really does, because more or less, Kevin Abrams has very little scouting background. More or less, what you're doing in that circumstance is putting a rubber stamp in the GM chair.
Yeah.
So more or less, you're handing complete control of the organization to Joe. And I just don't know, that's another thing I don't know that he deserves that.
No.
And I don't know that it changes enough within the organization. It really doesn't change anything within the organization. And I just don't know that that's a good path to go down.
No. I think we talked about this last week as far as how wide a net the Giants should cast on their GM search. And while I think, Abrams is an obvious candidate and deserves an interview and should be considered, he is, I feel like, also a really good example of someone who might just be a little too close to home. I understand why we're interviewing, Patriots candidates, and why people within that organization, why their names have come up a lot. That makes a lot of sense to me. That feels like the right type of inner circle to be working in. But someone who is already so tied in with the organization, I struggle to see how his decisions would be any different from the decisions Gettleman has made. Of course, we don't know that exactly. We can't delineate that, but he feels like someone who might just be too close to the situation and not provide enough of the different perspective and not challenge the Giants enough and just not, like you said, not really help and not change very much. I think the net needs to be cast a little bit wider than that. Even if he's technically the best candidate or the best fit, maybe that's also part of the problem here.
Right. I think that I said this as far back as 2015, when I felt like after that season, the Giants, whether he retired, whether they fired him, whatever the circumstance was, they pushed Tom Coughlin out the door. They made Tom Coughlin the scapegoat for a couple of bad seasons and decided to move on. The mistake that they made at the time was not letting go of Coughlin, because it was time for Tom to go. I think you could see that on the field, and you could see that in his treatment of Odell Beckham, the fact that he was kind of turning a blind eye to Beckham and all of those kinds of things. The mistake that they made at the time was trying to piecemeal a situation together. The thing to have, for my money, the thing to have done at the time was to also remove Jerry Reese, whether you blamed him or not, and also to remove Eli Manning, who was nearing the end of his career. I mean, the Giants probably waited 4 years too long to move on from Eli Manning. You can easily make that argument, but the thing to have done at the time was to start over. I don't know who the head coach would have been. I don't know who the GM would have been. I don't know who they would have drafted to play quarterback or what they would have done there. But what I do know is, had they done that, I feel like they'd be farther ahead of the game now than where they are. And I feel like they're still trying to say, they're still not being completely honest with themselves, that their organization itself is broken, that the way that they do things is broken. And that to me, what they really need desperately is somebody to come in here and honestly evaluate who on the roster belongs here, who on the coaching staff belongs here, who in the front office is helping and who isn't helping, and really, take a solid look at this organization from top to bottom. And I feel like that's the one thing they just don't want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that it's definitely scary to just kind of completely start over and start fresh. But I think, especially at this point, the Giants are at a point in the season where now, I mean, they have the same record as the Texans and the Jets and the teams that, for the majority of the season, we considered the worst in the NFL. I feel like you can't even talk about the Jaguars. There's too much going on there to even really fully assess what's going on. They don't count. Poor Trevor Lawrence just deserves another try next season. He deserves a fresh start.
Can he go back into the draft?
Truly,
Can he go back
maybe
into the
try him
draft?
out in New York.
If he could go back into the draft, then maybe we could draft Lawrence and start over.
We could start over. I think he will. I mean, God, he's got to have a better season than he did this season in Jacksonville, just off field, not even on the field.
There you go.
So
there you go.
But I think if the Giants are now in the conversation with some of what we've kind of come to believe are the worst teams in the league,
if they are.
They are. You're right.
Yes.
Don't know why I'm speaking in uncertainties. They absolutely are. Then I think, when I look at like the Jets or the Texans or some of these teams, I think about just the complete rebuild that needs to go on. And I think that same mindset needs to now really be applied to the Giants, which is even something I sort of resisted doing. And I resisted grouping them in this lower echelon of the NFL. I feel like I even pushed back from that as well. But I think if you're the Giants, you need to really look at yourselves and be like, this is really bad at this point. Like if we're not going to compare to our own history, which is also bad, then let's look around the league and see just how badly we are performing and what you would tell the Jets to do, what you would tell other teams to do, and think about how we can turn it around at this point, because they really, I mean, I think they kind of just need to start fresh, like these other teams in the league that are at the, the lowest levels. So.
And I look at the NFC East and I look at where Washington and Philadelphia were at the end of last season. And now, and I thought, it was basically Dallas by itself, and then these other three teams trying to get off the floor, basically. And you look at Washington and you look at Philly, and it looks like both of those teams have gotten up off the floor, whereas the Giants have just dug themselves a deeper hole.
Yes. I mean, I think Washington revisited the floor a little bit last night, but I think that is definitely true for the most part. I think that there are just leadership styles in place in both Philadelphia and Washington that you can see being the foundation of a team. I think Rivera established that very quickly. Nick Sirianni has, if anything, he's established the run game in Philadelphia in just unprecedented ways. And he's just found something that the Eagles can hang their hat on week after week. These teams have just found things that they can identify themselves with, and that in times of weakness or in times when they're not playing well, they can rely on and they can go back to. And it didn't take them long to do that. I mean, Nick Sirianni's still in his first season, Ron Rivera's in his second. And yeah, I agree with you. They are showing signs of actual progress. They are showing signs of getting somewhere. And we don't see that with the Giants at all. It's almost a little funny. Like you have to laugh about it a little bit, because we're not seeing that room for improvement or growth.
Well, there's plenty of room for improvement. There's just none happening. We talk about Joe every week, and it's understandable, absolutely understandable, that the Giants want to get off this merry-go-round of hiring a new head coach every 2 years. And we talk about this all the time, but week after week, I just look for something from Joe, some sign. And now let's be realistic. He's playing without his quarterback, and we can argue about how good Daniel Jones is or isn't. But each week when the Giants play miserable football, they haven't scored a meaningful touchdown. I mean, they have scored some touchdowns in garbage time. They have not scored a meaningful touchdown since he got hurt.
Yeah.
Not one single touchdown in a meaningful part of a game since he got hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep looking at it and going, maybe he's better than we think. I don't know that for sure, but maybe he's better than we think, because maybe he's been lifting this team more than we know. And I don't want people to say, "Oh, you're fawning over Daniel Jones and this and that," because I'm not. Daniel Jones hasn't been good enough. But there's a huge difference, between what we saw with Jones playing quarterback, which still wasn't great, and what we're seeing now. And my point to go back to is, the only reason that the Giants can offer for staying with Joe Judge is that we just don't want to fire another head coach after 2 years. That's the only reason they can offer.
Yeah.
Because he's not giving them anything. And I know you're working with a bad offensive line, and I know you're working, with quarterbacks who probably don't belong in the NFL. But the fact that you're working with backup quarterbacks who don't belong in the NFL is your own fault.
Right.
Because you had to choose those players. And the fact that you're working with a broken offensive line is your own fault, because you were part of the decision-making group that decided to go with this offensive line. You were part of the decision-making group that decided to draft a cornerback in the 3rd round instead of an offensive lineman that might give you some depth. So this is your own fault. The guy who's calling the plays now is the guy that Joe Judge has really actually wanted calling the plays for 2 years. And yet the Giants can't put together a coherent game plan.
No.
They run the ball for 5 yards with a 3rd-string quarterback, and then rather than run the ball again and try to get a first down, they decide to throw the ball twice and punt. How about you run the ball a couple times, get a first down, lean into the fact that, and I'm going to say this, Devontae Booker might be your best offensive player, not Saquon Barkley. How about you lean into the fact that Devontae Booker might be your most productive offensive player, and let him try to run the ball 15, 18 times in a game and see what happens.
Right.
But they can't put together a coherent offensive game plan. They can't manage situations. And, it just looks like they have no plan. And that has to reflect on the head coach. And as much as I like Joe as a person, and I want him to succeed, The only possible reason you can offer for keeping him is that we just don't want to fire another head coach. And,
Oh,
and,
yes.
and I'm not sure that's good enough.
Yes, I think if the Giants weren't coming off of tumultuous seasons in which they have already had a lot of coach movement and a lot of changes. I think maybe, if Judge was at the start of this or something, or if we just had more consistency over the past 5 years, then I think Judge goes this season. It's just funny how much this needs to be taken into the context of everything else. And I almost think the Giants' history is weirdly benefiting him right now, because the Giants just don't want more turnover or more turmoil or anything of the sort. So they would rather stick with him. But I think in a different setting, I mean, look at how they got rid of Coughlin. It was time for Coughlin to go, but it hadn't reached this level.
Right.
This is very, very bad. And yet they're choosing to stay with him. And you can only think it's because they just want to be right and they want some stability among the organization. But I think if this happens at another time with another Giants team, even 4 years ago or 5 years in the future, he would be gone. I don't know that we would even be talking about it. And that's probably part of the problem.
Absolutely, it's part of the problem. I think the Giants, seemingly to me, if the reporting that I've read and the things that I've been told, about the Giants are accurate, they just don't want to face how broken their organization is.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't fix it by piecemealing it. I mean, maybe you get lucky. Maybe you bring in somebody with connections to Joe and it works. Maybe Joe is a personnel guru and he can
Mm-hmm.
guide Kevin Abrams to the right players. I don't know, but you're crossing your fingers and hoping to get lucky.
Mm-hmm. At this point, if you're the Giants, if something goes right, it will be luck. It won't be because you made organizational decisions or choices that changed anything. Because, especially if they stick with someone like Abrams, it will just be luck. And the only problem with luck is good, but it's not sustainable. You don't build
Right.
winning franchises on luck. I mean, I think the really good teams probably have a little bit of that on their side, but it's also because they have a strong foundation on which to build upon. So even if that is the case and the Giants get lucky, that's not a long-term solution. And the Giants are in dire need of a long-term answer at this point.
Yes, they are, Em, and I don't know about you, but I am in dire need of this season being over.
2 more weeks.
2 more weeks. 2 more weeks. There you go. Em, thank you very, very much. Giants fans, as always, please hit the subscribe button if you like the show here on YouTube. And also, if you like what you hear on Big Blue View Radio, if you're listening on our podcast platforms, thank you very, very much. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.